members, IPC, and our fellow members of this district. At the technical session for this month, we will be talking about the finance bill, the rudiments that we need to know, understand the rudiments. And we are all aware that finance bill usually comes into law by the end of, in the past 3 years, has been signed into law before the end of the year. But the one for 2022 seems to be out of the trend. We've had 2019 signed in 2019 was a one that shifted a bit. We have 2020, we have 2021, and then we have 2022, which is not yet signed, but we know it may be signed any moment from now, even though it has passed through the stages. But I think there are 1 or 2 areas that needs to be streamlined. So we still need to get ourselves acquainted with the content, even though it's not yet an act, because when it's assented to by the president, it becomes a finance act. Now, whether we are not going to have it as Finance Act 2022 or Finance Act 2023 is another question that we need to be answering. But for the purpose of even getting our knowledge up to date on what the Finance Act 2020, Finance Bill 2022 stands to be for us, as at the time it was passed by the House. We have one of our resource persons by name, Babatunde Olani. He's an associate director, PwC Nigeria. He has worked on several tax strategy, transformation advisory, tax audits, and financial reporting engagements involving clients in the financial services, telecommunications, consumer goods, and pharmaceutical industries. Babatunde has over 11 years taxation and advisory experience with PwC Nigeria and PwC United Kingdom. He's an associate member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria and the Chartered Institute of Taxation of Nigeria. He's also a holder of the Advanced Diploma in International Taxation with the Chartered Institute of Taxation UK. I think one of the things I want to tell us is that I've told Babatunde that he's not going to take this session without being a member of Ilupeju Gbagada district of ICANN and also upgrading himself to a fellow. I'm committing that on his behalf, and I know he will confirm it in the course of his presentation. Join me to welcome Babatunde Olani as he takes us through the Finance Bill 2022, understanding the rudiments. Thank you. Babatunde, you're welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Good afternoon. And good afternoon, everyone. Doctor, can you confirm you can hear me loud and clear?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. And you can see my screen as well?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. And I will not disappoint you, right? So I will upgrade my fellowship to fellow, and I will also join the Gbagada district, right? The model district, as I hear, right? Thank you, everyone, and thank you very much for the privilege to come and present to you today. It's a privilege for me to be here, right? So the subject matter for today is the Finance Act. So pretty much, as Dr. Fulcon was saying, Nigeria has made it a tradition now, right, to sign a Finance Act alongside the national budget. Right? So that is one aspect of the budget process that investors, businesses, relevant stakeholders are eagerly waiting on an annual basis, right, to see what changes are coming through from a tax standpoint, right, to support the fiscal policies of government that will be demonstrated in its numbers stated in the national budget, right? So it has so happened that over the past 3 years, the Finance Act 2019 to 2021 was signed simultaneously with the national budget, but the Finance Bill 2022 unfortunately did not go through that same process, right, because there were some inefficiencies, right, in the process, some of which I will speak to shortly, right? So when looking at the Finance Bill, was something that we believe was rushed, right? Because if you look at how the normal process, which is the finance, the executive arm of government will draft the bill and send it to the House for review, right? And found out that almost towards the end of the year, the Senate arm of the government came up with a public notice to come have a public hearing, right? And pretty much stated the date to be the next day. We didn't give the relevant stakeholders enough time, right, to come and prepare, travel down if necessary, to make relevant contributions to the laws. We also saw the House of Reps as well, right, who came out with a public notice, even though they had called their own public hearing to happen January 13th, which was the expectation, right? And unlike the Senate, there was adequate time for preparation. It just so happened that a few days later, we just saw that the House of Reps had passed the finance bill without any consultation hearing at all, right? So that puts the question the due process that such important legislation would pass through, right? If you compare that with what happens in the global or even our neighbors here in Africa, right? Adequate due process wasn't really followed. So it was not unusual when the president refused to provide assent, right, to the finance bill and really sent it back to the National Assembly and the executive arm for some rework, right? And some of the contentious provisions of the finance bill we will speak to subsequently. So just to pretty much give us an outline as to how this presentation would be. So we'll be going through 4 different categories. So the first is pretty much just setting the scene behind the finance bill. We know pretty much in managing the economy, there's the fiscal side, there's the monetary side. The monetary side is pretty much handled by the CBN, right? Whilst the fiscal side is handled by the federal government. And a lot of the policies are underpinning such fiscal policies, right, are stated in the finance bill, right? And those are pretty much stemming from the trends that we're seeing in the economy, right, and in the daily lives of Nigerians, right? So we're also going to be touching about on the national budget 2023, what the numbers look like, what our expectations will be for the year, right? And also looking at some of the key rudiments of the finance bill, right? What are those key provisions that the Finance Act is really looking to amend, right? And what are the likely implications for businesses, for accountants, right, that are advising such companies, and pretty much how to stay abreast of whatever compliance obligation opportunities that exist within the law. Then lastly, we'll talk to pretty much steps to stay ahead, right, to ensure that we continue to stay ahead of the curve. So if we look at pretty much some of the key things that we're seeing in the economy, right? We see that the businesses for 2022, right, there is some level of commendation, right, that every business that withstand 2022, right, should get in terms of appreciation, right? Because 2022 was a very, very challenging year, right? Because if we look at the fact that Nigeria's business climate is very tough, some of the reasons for the harsh environment are dependent on the fact that we're in a globalized economy. So a lot of things that are happening in our neighbors in Africa globally will definitely have a direct impact on our economy, right? If we look at the Russia-Ukraine war, right, all of a sudden that came up and pretty much skyrocketed the oil price. And that's pretty much helped from a Nigerian revenue standpoint. If you also look at the fact that it also provided opportunities for gas, right? Because all the other European countries were looking to pretty much pivot their place of supply of gas, which was previously Russia, right, to other sources, right, which Nigeria hopefully can take advantage of, right? If you now look at other things like the supply chain issues, right, the fact that a lot of the supplies that are required by Nigerian businesses in carrying out operations, right, are either not available, right, because demand trumps supply, right, or where they are available, it takes a very, very long time for them to come in country. And even when they come in country, we know what's happening with our Nigerian ports. It takes a lot of time, right, for it to get to the place of destination, thereby making it difficult for companies to pretty much serve their customers, right? And if we then layer on top of that, right, issues around inflation going to a record high, not only in Nigeria, but also globally as well, right? And a lot of the global inflations are factored into the goods that we import. So we have also imported inflation that is reflected in our numbers as well, right? Which also has an impact as well on our exchange rates, given multiple exchange rates, the fact that there's a huge gap between the official rates and the power market rates, which pretty much from an investor standpoint doesn't send the right policies, right? The likes of IMF, of CBN are pretty much anchored on government, right, to do something about their multiple exchange rates in terms of harmonizing it, right? On the other hand, we also look at the deficits, right? It's pretty much around 10, 11 trillion, right? And pretty much signifies that government needs a lot of revenue, right, in order to fulfill its budgeted expenditure of around 21.8 trillion naira for this year, right? And that kind of cascades into the revenue generating agencies that are seeking to generate revenue for government, where they would then start having very, very high targets, right? Likes of FIRS, customs, upstream commission. Definitely these government agencies will be looking to generate revenues, thereby having targets that could lead to aggressive policies. We've seen what we see FIRS pretty much do. I was looking at the budget and we saw that over 60 government-owned enterprises, right, have revenue targets for 2023, right? So if you then cascade that, and you could then see those targets being built into the approaches of these regulators, right, in terms of their views on some technical issues, the fact that there are more tax audits and investigation exercises now. Customs take very aggressive views on goods imported, right? And pretty much looking at various things that I was seeing in the economy. There's also insecurity, right? So insecurity is pretty much baked into a lot of the issues that we're having now from a food supply standpoint, and also foreign investment, because investors do not want to come and invest in an environment where their investments will not be secured, right? And we've seen a lot of those investors pretty much take a very cautious approach towards the Nigerian market, and either they move from foreign direct investments, which requires them to kind of situate a plant here or actual businesses here, to portfolio investment, which is pretty much investing in shares, bonds, and things like that, right? And also the food challenges are also corroborated by the climate issues that we've seen, the flooding that happened, right, across Nigeria, affecting food crops, affecting infrastructure, right? And it's not only something that's happening with Nigeria, it's also happening globally, right? So that is something that is having a negative impact on Nigeria's productivity, right? And also is pushing Nigeria to think about their impact on the climate, right? And what our contributions would be as a nation. Then in terms of the revenue tag projections for the FIRS, the FIRS recently announced, right, that a revenue of 10.1 trillion naira revenue was collected for 2022, right? This was something that the FIRS actually predicted, right, in 2021, right, when they were making their presentations to the federal government at the National Assembly in particular, right, as to their revenue projections, right, for the next 3 years when they were presenting the medium tax expenditure framework, right? And it was something that was actually achieved, right? If we look at the numbers in a bit more detail, you realize that a lot of the factors that drove this revenue were pretty much leveraging on the fact that FIRS has moved a lot of the compliance obligations now, right, to a technology platform called Tax Pro Max, right? And that has pretty much streamlined the compliance process, right? It's definitely not without its teething problems. So there are teething problems that definitely the FIRS is looking to address. There are also things around the oil price being very high because petroleum profit tax increased by 100%. And the fact that over time, the Finance Act has pretty much focused on expanding our tax base, right? So you see our tax laws now bringing into the Nigerian tax net, non-resident companies are now paying income tax in Nigeria. Transactions with foreign digital companies like of Google, Netflix are now vatable, right? Even those transactions with corporate customers, transactions with individual customers, so B2C, B2B, are now within the VAT net, right? They're now vatable. There are now obligations on these foreign digital companies to account for the VAT, thereby plugging the hole on B2C customers, right? So we see, even as recent as last year, in terms of the removal of the exemption on the capital gain on sale of shares, right? That also has also contributed tax revenue, and also the increase of the tertiary education tax from 2% to 2.5%, right? That happened last year, which also contributed to the increase in the TET payments to government, right? So this is something that is it's a good thing. We believe the FIRS has the ability to do more, right? And definitely the aim is on government to pretty much focus on productivity, because with productivity, there will be enough revenue created, value created, which would then lead to not only increased revenue for government, but also contribute favorably to our GDP, and remove a lot of people from poverty, contribute positively to employment, and pretty much improve, right, the average quality of life, right, of Nigerians, as they've called Nigeria now the poverty capital of the world. They say over 130 million of Nigerians are poor, right? They're not only poor, they are multidimensionally poor, right? So in many factors than one: health, education, infrastructure, schools, and things like that, right? So hopefully government will be more accountable with the money that it generates, right? So that will positively affect morale of taxpayers, and those that are outside the tax net can be persuaded, right, to contribute their own quota, right, towards the development of Nigeria. So if we want to quickly look at some of the key features of the national budget of 2023, I think it's only right to look at 2022, look at how the budget was implemented, right? Pretty much also getting some insights from that and trying to preempt, right? Looking at our implementation history on how the 2023 budget would be implemented, right? As a 2022 budget, we had a fiscal deficit of 8 trillion naira. And if you look at the year-to-date numbers that the Minister of Finance presented, in terms of aggregate revenue, January to November numbers are pretty much around the fact that we budgeted a 9.9 trillion revenue. We're at 6.4, right? In terms of expenditure as well, we budgeted 18 trillion. We are at 12.99 trillion, right? So that kind of cements the fact that over time, we've had an extremely under-implemented budget, right? So there's one thing for government to say they will do this A, B, C, and D in the budget, right? And we see over time, right, they either achieve 60% of the revenue targets, right, and close to 100% of the expenditure targets, right? As the head of the budget office, right, said, right, that the budget is really not a true document. Is pretty much a promise, right, of what government is seeking to achieve, right? So 100% implementation is really not a key area of focus, right? And in terms of one thing that I wanted to draw out in this slide is really our debt service, right? Because a lot of the issues that have come from our debt profile is really not our debt to GDP ratio, which is still one of the lowest in the world. Is around 40% of our GDP, right? Where the concern is, right, is around our revenue to debt service ratio, right? Which is pretty much around 80 to 90% of every naira that is generated by the federal government is used to service debt, right? So we had a budget of 2.9 trillion as at 2022, and our actual as at January to November 2022 was 5.2 trillion. We've almost doubled what, if not doubled, we've almost doubled what our budgeted debt service cost was, right? And given where we are going to now from a 2023 standpoint, where we have a fiscal deficit of 11 trillion, right? And within the expenditure framework, we have a debt service that will double, right? Which is around 6 trillion, right? It pretty much puts a lot of pressure, right, on revenue collections for government. And we know over time, government has shifted focus, right, to generating non-oil revenue, mainly from tax. Now, in terms of looking at our deficit for 2023, we have an 11 trillion deficit, as I stated earlier. From a revenue standpoint, we have an estimated budget of around 10 trillion naira, right? Majority of it is coming from oil revenue. The most of it is coming from federal independent revenues, right? Whilst the second place is non-oil tax, which is non-oil revenues, which is pretty much taxes, right? So in terms of the federal independent revenue, one might ask what is in there, right? So there are things around privatization of government assets, which Nigerians are very divided on. There are also bid rounds, right, coming from the oil and gas industry. Nigeria is currently winning a mini bid round for 7 offshore oil blocks, right? So definitely the signature bonus that will be paid by these companies in order to acquire the rights to develop in those offshore grounds will pretty much be part of the source of revenues that will be accrued to governments. One standout item coming from the budget is the 3.6 trillion naira subsidy, right, which is meant to cover the estimated subsidy between January and June, right? And hopefully by June, right, with the right political will, government can have the will to remove the subsidy entirely, right? And pretty much hope that would alleviate, right, the pain that Nigerians are facing in terms of harnessing the real value from our oil and gas deficits, given all the large queues that we're seeing and the large deficits and poor midstream and downstream infrastructure in the oil and gas space. So quickly moving into the finance bill, right, and some of the rudiments and key changes, right? So the anchor for this year's finance bill are based on 5 main pillars, right? So the first is to provide tax equity, right? Because one of the tenets of a good tax system is equity, where everyone is equal under the law, right? So the tax laws do not provide undue favoritism towards a certain class of taxpayers. There's also changes that are anchored on climate change and green growth. Nigeria attended COP27 that happened in Egypt and pretty much made commitments, right, to the world that certain changes will be made. We know that Nigeria has enacted the climate law, right, and Nigeria pretty much wants to do more, right, and some of the changes in the finance bill are tilted towards the commitments that Nigeria has made, and we'll speak to that a bit more further. Right, there's also tenets on job creation, economic growth, and there's also another one on reforming tax incentives. So tax incentives is one of the key area of focus for the Nigerian government now, right? Because they're looking for revenue, and the focus has been on taxes. So pretty much the federal government through the National Assembly and its oversight functions are pretty much questioning government agencies on tax incentives. So you see them engaging the Nigerian Investment Promotion Council on things like Pioneer, right, to ensure that Pioneer incentive is not abused. You also see them also interrogating the Federal Ministry of Finance for import duty waivers given to certain companies. In certain areas, also the FIS as well, with CAFA, Certificate of Asset Acceptance, right? So the focus has been on tax incentives. And recently, the Ministry of Finance have come up with a tax expenditure framework, pretty much looking at how much revenue that Nigerian government is losing by way of incentives, and pretty much scrutinizing them, right, to see if Nigeria is really getting the value that we deserve, right, from our tax incentive that we give out. And the last but not the least is around revenue generation, right? So some of the changes and the objective behind them are very, very clear. Nigeria needs money. We need to generate more money, right? And we'll speak to that a bit further, right? And it's also sad, right, that in terms of the fact that Nigeria needs revenue, right, there are many ways in which those revenues can be generated. They can be generated by increasing the taxpayers in the tax net, and trying to go after the tax evaders, right, and not trampling on the already compliant taxpayers by loading them with more taxes, more audits and things like that. Now there's also widening the tax base as well, right? But what Nigeria seems to be focusing on now is really to increase the rates, right? Just to push more money from the hands of taxpayers to the government. The finance bill seeks to amend 11 laws, right, coming from the Capital Gains Tax Act, Companies Income Tax Act, Petroleum Profit Act, and Tertiary Education Tax, Value Added Tax, and also 5 other laws as well. If we look at one of the key changes that have made the rounds, right, it's the increase in the tertiary education tax rate by another 0.5% to 3%, right? This was something that the FIS, as recent as the Finance Act 2021, increased from 2% to 2.5%, right? So if the bill gets signed as is, right, it means that Nigeria has increased the tertiary education tax by 50% between 2022 and 2023, right? Pretty much, if you look at how the taxes are moving in isolation, you might be tempted to say that 0.5% is just really a small number. But if you look at if you put that on top, right, of already high income tax rates, because we have our income tax rate is top line is 30%, which is one of the highest in the world, right? If you put the tertiary education tax rate of 3% on top of that, and if you then juxtapose that with the police trust fund, the NIDA levy, the NASENI levy, local content, and all the other taxes now that companies are paying, you find that the effective tax rate of companies could be as high as 38%, close to 40%, right? So that's something that it's uncertain whether commitments were made by the federal government to ASU during the long-term strike in 2022, and that more funds will be pushed towards the tertiary education sector in Nigeria, because I think they did come out to say through their executive secretary that they were pushing for even 10%, right? Even though we have not really seen that much value from the 2 trillion naira that they've collected over the past 10 years, right? So pretty much the tertiary education tax rate seems to be going up, right? And it keeps going up, right? So it's something that Nigerian companies would have to deal with if the bill is signed the way it is. The other one that complicates it again, right, is the amendment that was made to the Customs Excise Tariff Act, right, where with the Finance Act 2021 as well, where government, right, came up with excise duties to apply on telecommunication services. The executive regulation was issued, where it was announced that a 5% excise duty would apply on telecommunication services, right? There was a lot of back and forth between the Ministry of Digital Economy and Communications and the Federal Ministry of Finance, right? And the excise duty was pretty much put on hold after an interministerial committee was put together, including the private sector, right, to pretty much work on how to best implement this provision of the law, right? And it just so happens that the finance bill, even after these controversies are going on the existing excise duty and telecommunication services, pretty much came up with the idea to apply excise duties on all services in Nigeria, right? So it's pretty much definitely going to affect the inflation that we're facing right now, because definitely these companies will not want to retain those costs because margins are already slim now, given the tough environment, right? And they will seek to push this cost to their customers, right? Whose purchasing power is also reducing as well, given the high cost and the fact that there's a lot of poverty in the land. Now, in terms of compliance, applying excise duty on all services when there is VAT, that also applies on the supply of vatable services as well, right? It seems to be some kind of duplication, right, which could further complicate the Nigerian tax compliance outlook, right? So this is one of the changes that we are hoping, right, that despite the fact that Nigeria needs money, right, does not make it to the final version of the act, right, because there are other laws that can be utilized to achieve this objective if they really need to go through this route, right? And rather than just applying excise duties on all services that is rendered in Nigeria. The other thing that needs to also be checked as well is the compliance burden, right, that it would then take for companies to comply, right? The reverse charge VAT, right, took a lot of companies time to reconfigure their systems to comply with the fact that companies that don't charge them VAT, they now have the obligation to reverse charge themselves VAT and file. We saw a lot of companies that had to write to the FIs that they needed more time to configure their ERP to be able to meet that compliance requirement. Now they will have to do the same thing too now, right? If this excise duty requirement comes through with the final version of the bill and makes its way to the act, right? So that's another cost, right, that definitely is then put on the taxpayer as well, right, in terms of compliance. The other one again that seems to push an additional tax again is the amendment that introduces 0.5% levy on eligible goods that are imported into Nigeria from outside Africa. This is in the bill meant to achieve and fund Nigeria's obligation to our supranational organizations, the likes of the African Union, likes of the World Bank, subscriptions, etc. Right? Looking at the trend of all this, right? The TET and the excise duties, the 0.5 import levy on goods outside into Nigeria from outside Africa, one can say that it's looking like government is pretty much looking or taking the approach whereby in order to solve any problem, we throw money at it, right? Because if we look at the educational sector, tertiary education tax, right, they have a problem. They're pushing 0.5% to it. In terms of we need revenue as a government, putting excise duty on all services. We need science and technology development by putting a semi levy, right? We need to fund our subscriptions to African Union. Let's introduce another tax, right? It's pretty much, we have an issue, let's put a tax to it. Let's earmark a tax to it, or let's increase an existing tax rate to accommodate our obligations to expend, right? So that approach is really not sustainable, right? Because we're taxing businesses out of existence, right? And we're making it difficult, right, for Nigeria to attract the much needed investments that it needs to grow our economy in a way that will make Nigeria a a wealthy nation. Now, looking at the oil and gas sector, right? One of the changes that was made to the Companies Income Tax Act is to increase the tax rate of a company that is tend to be a gas flaring company, right? So if you flare gas, right, under circumstances that are not permitted under the Petroleum Industry Act, right, your tax rate will increase from 30% to 50%, right? So those are for companies that have converted to the Petroleum Industry Act, right, and are now paying taxes under the Companies Income Tax Act, and also supposed to pay hydrocarbon tax. Their tax rate, if you flare gas, would increase from 30% to 50%. For companies that have not converted, who are solely taxed under the Petroleum Profit Tax Act, whose profits are not subject to the Companies Income Tax Act, what the law says is that we also have a package for you, right? We will not increase your tax rate because we know Companies Income Tax Act does not apply to you. What we're going to do is to say that you would pay 50% of the market value of the gas that you flare or you vent, right? You will pay 50% of that, right, as an added penalty. And this is bearing in mind that today there is a regulation that imposes gas flaring penalties on these companies that flare gas, right? And the penalty rate is $2, which is close to the market price, right, of natural gas, right, per every 1,000 standard cubic feet of gas flared. And also taking into consideration that not all companies flare gas as a result of the fact that they want to, right? A lot of these companies came to drill oil, right, and not gas, right? Gas was just found in association with the oil that we are producing, right? And given the fact that we have a lot of infrastructural challenges in the oil and gas space, right, gas is not commercial for companies to actually invest a lot of money in there. But that is not actually the problem. The problem is that even though we understand the angle in which the federal government is coming to, right, they have made commitments to the world that they need to produce in an efficient manner, right? They need to stop greenhouse gas emissions, right? The fact that you are not increasing your tax rate on companies that flare gas just some periods after you've introduced the Petroleum Industry Act, right? Under the Petroleum Industry Act, every company that produces oil and gas is meant to come up with a gas flare elimination and monetization plan, right? So the law already provides for every player to come up with that plan that will then show government how you intend, right, to eliminate your gas flaring, and also what's your plan for monetizing this gas, right? Now, when you then, off the back of that, then undermine that process by introducing, increasing tax rates and pretty much subjecting them to additional penalties on top of the gas flaring penalties they pay, right? It pretty much shows that government is really inconsistent with their policies, and we know what inconsistency brings to the table, right? Uncertainty, and investors do not really like uncertainty because a lot of the capital investments that are required in this sector are very capital intensive. They are long-term projects, right? So they can definitely not feel very comfortable investing in a region who can come up with a policy, a law now, then introduce another law now that seeks to undermine some of the benefits that are provided by the initial law. There are also incentives in there, right, to promote investments in gas production. There are 10% for those that are producing in a non-associated gas environment. For those that are producing gas in association with crude oil, a 5%. Right? There's some conditions in there that pretty much renders this incentive ineffective, right? And that goes to the heart of sometimes government not really understanding the industries they are drafting tax laws for, right? And pretty much from an incentive standpoint, right, you have to come up with incentive that can really trigger investments, not one that can be seen to be highly ineffective. One of the other things that the Finance Act seems to achieve, right, is to pretty much add upstream and midstream oil and gas companies to the exemption for the capital allowance restriction. So we know that under the law now, companies in the manufacturing and agro-island industry, right, can claim full capital allowance on in their competitions, right? They're not restricted to the 66 to third of their accessible profits. What the Finance Act does is that it also adds the upstream and midstream company to that bucket list, right? Where they will not have to exempt they will not need to restrict their capital allowance to 66 to third of their accessible profits. However, it does not include downstream companies, right? So one of the things that can be ironic, right, is the fact that for a finance bill that is seeking to achieve fiscal equity, right, looking at an industry now that is made up of three major value chains: upstream, midstream, downstream, and you're pretty much taking two out of the three and exempting them from restricting their capital allowances. I'm not including the other one, right? So you are unintentionally also increasing the fiscal inequity that is happening in this industry. So there's also, as I stated earlier, the focus on incentives, looking at how effective those incentives are, right, and whether they are seeking to achieve the objective of why those incentives were put in place in the first place, right? So some of the incentives that are being removed from the company's income tax by virtue of the finance bill is the plant and equipment investment allowance incentive, which pretty much entitles a taxpayer to 10% of their plant, equipment, and machinery, right? So you get an extra 10%, right? So this is something that I think is quite useful, right? And a lot of companies claim it, right? And I don't think it's something that should be removed at this time, right? I understand that there are stakeholders that were supporting in pushing for this to be retained in the law. There's also the rural investment allowance that was targeted towards incentivizing companies that invest in infrastructure in certain rural places as defined in the law, right, in terms of their kilometers from government provided infrastructure, in terms of road, in terms of power, in terms of water, right. It's pretty much seems to be very ineffective because it's not widely used by taxpayers. And I think one of the things that actually makes it more complicated is the fact that you can't claim the rural investment allowance and also the investment allowance. So it's an either or, right? So companies does choose the investment allowance of 10%, maybe from an administrative ease of implementation standpoint, right? Because for the rural one, you need to, there's certain conditions that you definitely need to meet in terms of the preconditions, right? Whilst for investment allowance is just pretty much straightforward. There's also the 25% income exemption for hotels who earn income in foreign currency, right? Where you could get 25% of that income exempted from tax, provided you put those income in a reserve that is used for expansion, right? The finance bill is pretty much removing that, right? So if the finance bill is signed as is, the rural investment allowance, the tax exemption of convertible currencies for hotels would be removed. The other thing I also wanted to mention is the amendments that was made to the Capital Gains Tax Act, right? One of the good things of the capital gains amendment is the fact now that you can now carry forward losses, right? And you can offset losses, right? Previously, under the existing law, right, you cannot carry forward losses, and you cannot net off a loss from a gain, even though they are in the same class of assets, right? So I can have two cars. I sell one for a gain, I sell one for a loss, right? Ordinarily, there is scope for you to offset the loss against the gain, right? That's how it works in certain jurisdictions. right, other than Nigeria, right? So the fact that you cannot offset such in Nigeria, right, was something unusual, right? But in line with international best practices, and government intend, right, to then make provisions for that in the finance bill, where you can offset and you can carry forward to be offset against gains from the same class of assets, right? So if you sell a building and loss, make a gain from a building, and offset the loss against the gains of the building. Please go on mute if you're not speaking. Thank you. So in that scenario, right, it's a very good thing. But you can't make a loss from a sale of a building and offset it against the gain that you make on the sale of an equipment, right? It has to be from the same type of assets. And if you make a loss on the sale of a capital asset, you can carry it forward for a limit of 5 years. Even though the losses you make under CETA can be carried forward indefinitely, right? Capital gains tax losses can be carried forward for 5 years. It might not be where we want to be, but we're not where we used to be, right? So it is an added step towards the final destination. The other amendment now is the fact that Nigeria now specifically mentions digital assets as a chargeable assets, right, which pretty much aligns the position with other countries like the UK, Kenya, where they have introduced laws that pretty much taxes digital assets. Given the wide range, right, of how chargeable assets was defined in the law, it's my belief that it will definitely have captured digital assets. But the fact now that the law specifically clears it out by stating it, right, makes it very clear and unambiguous, right, that the sale of digital assets are now subject to CGT, right, and pretty much, should I say, adds to the confusion that exists in Nigeria in terms of, on one hand, we have the CBN that says the banks cannot facilitate transactions in digital assets that are generated from cryptocurrencies, right? On the other hand, you have the Securities and Exchange Commission coming up with a regulation that seeks to recognize and legitimize digital assets. And that is now complemented by the CGT Act now that engraves digital assets as a chargeable gain, right? So there's that policy inconsistencies that need to be aligned, right, between SEC, FIRS, and CBN, and really what we're telling taxpayers and users of the financial markets. One of the changes to the VAT Act, which is one that is administrative, right, is one where for companies that are obligated by law to deduct VAT at source, such as oil and gas companies, now MTN, Glo, and the banks, right, you're obligated to remit the VAT on or before the 14th of every month, following the month of collection, right, of accountability, right? Previously, that was done on the 21st, right? But for some reason, government wants to bring that forward by 7 days, right? That means that companies will need to pretty much adjust their compliance process to ensure that they comply if the bill is signed into law as is. So one of the other things that came through as a result of non-resident companies, particularly in the digital space, that were appointed by the federal government to deduct VAT at source, right? One of those complications that it could bring about is that if you buy something from Amazon, for example, a good, and Amazon is an appointed agent of the FIRS, and they're meant to deduct and pay the VAT to the government, right? What then happens when you are clearing the same good at the port? The customs would want to ask you, right, to pay the VAT on the good, because they are the agency collecting VAT at the port, right? So one of the things that the finance bill does is that it then says that you will need to provide customs with an evidence that a non-resident entity that has been appointed by the FRS to deduct at source has deducted it at source, right? So you don't need to pay the VAT at the point of importation, right? So importers need such documentations. Now, the other aspect that was made to the Personal Income Tax Act is now the tax deductibility on annuity, deferred annuity products issued by insurance companies, right? That was previously not the case. So the deferred annuity product is one that was previously abused by taxpayers, but the tax laws have now made changes that would ensure, right, that you get tax benefits, but not in a way that is abused. Because if there's a withdrawal within 5 years, right, it gets taxed, right, similar to what happens to the voluntary contribution under the pension scheme, right, to ensure that at the end of the day, it's not abused from a tax standpoint. In terms of the Petroleum Profit Tax Act, it pretty much pushes fiscal equity because the penalties in the Petroleum Industry Act was higher than the one in the Petroleum Profit Tax Act. So these amendments does pretty much equates the penalties in the Petroleum Profit Tax Act, right, to equal that of the Petroleum Industry Act. So there is no fiscal equity, right, for taxpayers that are operating in that space in terms of how taxes are being administered. In terms of other changes that are made to the Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Act, the Public Procurement Act and Stamp Duties Act, in terms of the Stamp Duties Act, the Electronic Money Transfer Levy, previously under the Finance Act 2021, it was shared pretty much by federal government 15% and state government 85%, right? But the Finance Bill seeks to carve out 35% for local government. So it's very clear the portion that should go to the local government. And in terms of the amendments made to the Public Procurement Act and the Corrupt Practices Act, are just amendments made, right, to ensure that the policies and processes of government are done in a very efficient manner. So in terms of tips of staying ahead, right, the Finance Bill is not yet an act, right? So there is, as has happened in the past, right, where the Finance Act comes with changes that were not in the Finance Bill, right? Or they made small changes that could have big impacts, right, on how it is now written in the Finance Act. So we continue to stay abreast, right, of the changes when it actually does become an act, because as Dr. Fowokon said, right, it can be signed into law any moment from now, right? These are areas that put compliance obligations for our clients, right? So it's something that we need to take into cognizance in terms of the VAT, moving it from 21st of the month to 14th. In terms of incentive as well, and there's likely not going to be any investment allowance, right? So if you're pushing for investment allowance post the Finance Act, if it does move to the Finance Act the way it is, and that would definitely not be correct. We will not want to jeopardize the position of our clients, right? Definitely continue to push to ensure that if our clients are not sure, right, of what the position is, they should continue to seek us that are all professionals within the space, right, and all knowledgeable, right, so that we can continue to support, right, the tax system of the taxpayers and also Nigeria at large, right, and pretty much push for compliance, right, to ensure that there are no penalties for not compliance, right, and continue to stay vigilant, right. So I'll just stop here now for questions and answers. I know that took quite a bit of time.
Thank you, Baba. Today, I think it deserves a round of applause. He has given us an overview, the rudiments that we need to know about the Finance Bill 2022. I think we can actually give that an applause from our electronic platform as much as we can. There's a lot of questions agitating our minds, and I've actually been asking people to put their question in the chat box. I don't know if that has been done because I've not seen anyone. But what I want to say is to just start the pace by actually raising concern over a lot of things that we've seen in terms of the Finance Act, finance bill about to come up. In fact, if you look at the way the body will be, it means that all of us, all accountants on this platform and those listening should be on the lookout. You might find the problem that we had when VAT rate was increased and everybody was running helter-skelter to adjust from what we've been hearing. For those who are into forensic audit, we are now talking about digital currency, digital assets. We might need to start thinking of, do we really understand how to apply tax on digital assets? Is this a new way for us as accountants to re-strategize? These are things that should be agitating our mind. Let me not go into another lecture and allow questions to come in. I would like for us, if you have questions, you can raise your hand so we can quickly take the question. Any question? If you have a question, you can raise your hand. Venice, are you raising your hand or you are clapping? Do we have any question? Okay. Okay, Wale Alabi, can you quickly go to your question? Make it very brief and concise, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Good evening. Thank you for the well-delivered presentation. Thank you so much. We've learned a lot. I want to be very quick. First of all, you talked about excessive taxation of companies, which is almost about 40% now. And we all know that this will definitely stifle growth and expansion in those companies. But I want to ask you, does fiscal authorities engage with organized private sector, before fixing those rates? I just want to know, do they engage? For instance, now, if you put up a bill in the House of Assembly or at Senate, there's always public engagement, public interaction. Do they do that before, just coming up with taxation? Then secondly, on digital assets, it is complicated and it involves a lot of cross-border transaction. As a professional, do you want to tell federal government or fiscal authority that they should step down that aspect of finance before now? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Babasido, would you like to take the answer before we take more questions, or you want to take everything?
No, let me take it. Let me take it now. So,
okay.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Mr. Wale Alabi. Right. So, yeah, if we look at the outcome of the bill, right, one can be tempted to say that there hasn't been any consultations with the private sector, right, and organized so the organized private sector, right, because the taxes just seems to be increasing year in, year out, right. But one can say that this year has been quite unique in terms of how the bill was processed, right, and processed in the hands of the president, right. Initially in the past, right, they've had public hearings, we've made submissions, even during the National Tax Implementation Committee, right, which is embedded within the executive arm of government, is coming up with these proposals, right. They engage with the private sector advisors. We pretty much submit submissions, right, on some of the changes that we believe would be very good for the tax environment, right? Some of which are driven from our conversations with the industry, right? Pretty much, and that has led to successful changes in the past, right? But in this year, they've just done it in a way that maybe they wanted to ensure that it gets signed 1st of January, like it was in the past, where they pretty much just bypass those public engagements. But the president has refused to assent, right? So that process is pretty much ongoing as we speak, right? And we expect the final version to take into consideration the position of public stakeholders. On your point on digital assets, on the digital asset bit, the world is moving, right? And our tax system needs to move, right? Everyone is finding one way or the other to pretty much understand the fact that transactions are taking place using digital assets, using cryptocurrencies, using non-fungible tokens, right? And these are things that we need to update our laws, right, to meet current economic realities, particularly in the digital space, right? We know that there is still some learnings that need to be done, even by the tax authorities and also the taxpayers and also advisors as well, right? But one thing that we need to state is we need to send the right message, and we need to ensure that we have a legislative framework, right, that captures it, right? And that's what I would say on that.
Okay, thank you, Babatunde. We have another question, but I don't know if you would oblige me, let them just see your face to know who Babatunde is, if you are in a comfortable position, and then we will take the questions. Olayemi Ogunbode, you can go ahead with your question. Make it brief so that we can spend less time. Thank you.
To be honest, I'm having serious issues with my camera. I don't
No
know.
problem. You can leave it. You can leave it. Just want it. Yeah.
Okay.
Olayemi.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Good evening, Babatunde, and good evening, dear professional colleagues. That was a well-delivered paper. However, I know for sure that the firm you represent is a major stakeholder in the taxation industry of this country, and I want to believe that you have a major say in some of the provisions that we have in this bill at the moment. And like you rightly said in the course of your presentation, that is still a bill, it's not yet an act, and there might still be there might still be room for one thing or the other to still find its way into the eventual act. And one of the things that if the opportunity comes, right, and I want to know your own personal view on it, and if it is possible, if we can still have it in this current bill that is not yet the act yet, and there will still be subsequent bills in the future. In line with the FRS Establishment Act, going through this proposed amendment in the tax laws for this year, 2021 bill, there's nothing that addresses FRS Establishment Act, right? And FRS Establishment Act Section 68 says that when there's any law, that is inconsistent with the provisions of the FRS Establishment Act, the law in those other acts, becomes null and void to the extent of the inconsistency. So you want to expect that some amendments will be made, right, to reflect the current position as we have in the FRS Establishment Act, or rather make some provisions that amend the FRS Establishment Act so that everybody, the authority, the professionals, and the taxpayers are all on the same page. There's still a whole lot of controversies and inconsistencies between the Principal Act and the FRS Establishment Act. One of them is, the time for which the tax deducted is to be remitted. FRS Act is saying a particular day, then the Principal Act, CITA, is saying another day. I just want to have your view on this. Thank you.
Over to you, Babatunde.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you, sir, for your question. Right. The point you raised is a very valid one, right? That section 68 of the FRS Establishment Act is one that we've always utilized, right, for the purposes of penalties in terms of interest and penalties that would apply, particularly the interest element, which pretty much speaks to the monetary policy rates, right, plus the 5% spread issued by the Ministry of Finance through public notice, right? There is a need, right, for, as things are evolving, right, that the FRS Establishment Act as well should also evolve to ensure that things continue to stay, right, at par, right? I think what you're saying is one that is very valid. Now, if I look at the changes to the FRS Establishment Act, right, in the finance bill, right, and it's within the version that was submitted or amended by the House of Reps, right, in terms of changing the name of FRS to either the Federation Revenue Service or the National Revenue Service, because the two names were in the bill, right, and also separating the executive chairman from the Commissioner General, right? And all those changes. None amended that section that you mentioned, right? So I do agree with you that it's a problem, but I know that it's one that FIRS pretty much likes, because that portion of that act overrides any other law, and it helps them when it comes to penalty and interest, right? So it's one that I would say we will continue to monitor, right, by virtue of the finance bill, right, and also consider, right, where it's being utilized negatively to the taxpayers.
Okay, thank you, Babatunde. There is a question in the chat box that's by Bisiri Kolawole. I said, is the 0.5% levy on eligible goods imported outside Africa not a good way to encourage local consumption, considering the fact that we so too much rely on foreign goods as against local ones? What's your reaction to this?
Yes. Yes, thank you very much for the question, right? I think the question is pretty much anchored on it's what we produce, or produce what we eat, right? Or I mean, it's the reverse: produce what we eat and eat what we produce, right? That will really much help not only Nigeria but also the Africa economy, right? But that is pretty much an ideal situation, right? We are in a globalized economy now where a cost-efficient product being sold in China, right, would always beat the same product that is produced in Nigeria, and not because of any fault of the producers in Nigeria, but just because the price of the good produced in Nigeria is going to capture the factors of production, right, which pretty much is high. We know where diesel is, we know where power is, we know where finance is. Nobody wants to borrow at high interest rates, right? All those things will go into the price of the products, right? So if at the end of the day, everybody wants to gain market share, if you are selling a good that is high, that is very pricey, and somebody is selling it at a low price, even though they're getting it from China, right? The one from China would pretty much beat the person selling it from Nigeria, right? There is the notion to say that, at least in the oil and gas sector, right, that it's not oil and gas sector, in the logistics sector, right, that it is less costly, right, to ship a good from China to Nigeria than to move it from Apapa to Maiduguri, right? So there is the ideal situation, and there is also the reality on ground, right? The reality on ground today is that the factors of production in Nigeria is very high, right? Right. So Nigeria goods are not competitive, right, with goods, the similar goods produced in more efficient markets, right? The second dose of reality is the fact that a lot of equipment, plants and machineries that we use, we don't have the capabilities today to produce them, and they're still going to come from not only even outside Nigeria, but also outside Africa, right? So it's pretty much going to, at this moment, right, going to increase the cost of investment, right? And to the extent that Nigeria can build those capabilities in country, we know what the local content board is doing in the oil and gas space, right? If we can extend that towards other industry, we know there's a bill in the House to do that, right? To facilitate local content in all the industries where we can gain those capabilities, right? Depending when we can do that, right? We can pretty much simmer down on imposing taxes, to making the lives difficult for those that want to invest. That's what I'll say to that.
Okay, thank you very much. We know our time is fast spent. We need to wrap up. So I'll take the last question from Oluwaseun, Dr. Jed Diron. Make it very brief so that we can wrap up the technical session. while apologizing for members for taking more than the scheduled time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My question is more of a moral suasion. Given the fact that ICANN as a body plays a role also to protect public interest, I believe this bill has so many contradictions. Although in some areas, such as the rural tax regarding the capital allowance of 10%, shows some bit of sense, what I can say, a bit of reason in trying to encourage more like individual agricultural practices, especially as we see in other climes of West African zone, where individuals are allowed to bring in their goods into the market, not just waiting on the situation whereby they buy directly from the major sellers. They also go to their farms and bring it also to sell in the market, thereby reducing the price of goods and especially farmers markets. My specific question is, shouldn't ICANN be looking at some legal actions against some of these things where it affects the public or the general public, especially when they have such opportunity? Because on the business side, yes, we all adjust, but when it comes to a general public, they are more than the business community. Please, can you kindly share more light on the possibility of that? Thank you.
Not taking the word out of Babatunde's mouth, I know Babatunde will not be able to speak for ICANN, but I believe that maybe our IPC, when he's doing his closing remarks, would shed some light. But Babatunde, you can give it a try.
Yes, doctor. So it is. I'm coming. I'm here, doctor. Yeah. So
yeah,
I just wanted to just say that definitely, ICANN is very much active, right, in terms of contributions, right. I know that one of the first analysis, right, that I did, right, was on the auspices of ICANN, right, in terms of really focusing on the oil and gas changes, because it was pretty much the changes around the increase in the tax rates, right, from 30 to 50%, right, even though there were gas flaring fees, right, that really provided the basis on which accent was not provided by the president, right? And we had to do that analysis, right, to support ICANN's position paper, right, as those changes related to those sectors. So I do know that, and as I've been involved, right, that activities are actually going on, right, because some of these changes would definitely seem not to align with things that would be in favor of public interest, just as you have mentioned, right? And all I can just say to end it is, with ICANN, with the organized private sector, civil societies, tax advisors, we will definitely continue, right, to speak to government through the open channels, public hearings, private engagements, special meetings, right, in order to ensure that whatever comes through in form of our laws, regulations, circulars are one that is best fit, right, and pretty much balances the position of both the government and also the private sector.
Thank you, Babatunde, for that attempt. I think I would want to ride on the back of what you have said, to say that we should all get our PVC and get the right person in. If we have legislators who knows the implication of all these laws on businesses and the people, then we'll start having a change in the type of amendments that are proposed for our law. And I think you can give credit to me. I said that, and I believe I stand on that. I have a hand raised, though I've closed the question session. Okay, Williams, let me just permit you, because we've actually closed the session. I'm already taking permission from the chairman to extend this time. Is this something you can do in 2 seconds?
Opportunity, really trying to listen. So I wasn't in a place that's very audible. So,
okay.
So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We really appreciate your ask a question or your inputs, because one of the callers has actually discussed the Forest Establishment Act. And one of the issues that some of our guys in the oil and gas, especially the downstream industry, are battling with is the proposed to the AGO. Just like, you know, the AGO does not enjoy the subsidy. And this AGO is one of the input factors in determining the input price of petrol. So no matter the number of barrels of petrol you have, if you don't have the AGO, you won't get it across to your customers. And I think the FRS Establishment Act is trying to introduce that VAT. So with the fact that the subsidy will be removed for PMS, the implication of having this AGO introduced to the VAT introduced to the AGO, what would be the implication on the economy as a whole? So I know it's going to increase the VAT, but then some policies that are coming out from the Establishment Act, and which is ready to the VAT Act, it might not be consistent with the finance bill and all the VAT acts entirely. So I just want your input on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Today.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you very much, sir, for your question. Right. I think your question speaks to the heart of the problem that we're pretty much having right now. I think in terms of availability of petroleum products, AGO, PMS, right? As of today, right, only PMS is the regulated petroleum product that we have, right? AGO is unregulated, right? And that's why the price could rise as much as 900 to a liter at some point, right? Compared to PMS that we don't know whether it is 200 today or 165 today, because the federal government is extremely holding on to the regulated price and subsidy, right? It's FRS's position today, right, that AGO is vatable, right? Even before this finance bill, is the position that AGO is a vatable product. Why? Because it was not specifically exempted, right, in the VAT modification order, right? The VAT modification order lists petroleum products, right? It lists PMS, it lists DPK, kerosene, right? It lists aviation fuel, right? But it doesn't state AGO, automotive gas oil, right? So it's one can only say, right, as my lawyers say, right, there's nothing easier than to say so, right, when writing laws, right? So if the intention, right, of the law was to exempt AGO from VAT, there's nothing easier than for it to state it, right, similar to what they had done, right, with the other petroleum products that was specifically exempted. Now, in practice, we know that the oil marketers are really pushing against this position of the FIRS. They're really pushing for an amendment, right? But unfortunately, that clear exemption did not make its way to the finance bill, right? So I understand that FIRS had sometime towards the end of last year raised assessments to oil marketers and VAT on AGO, right? I don't expect that to change going forward, right? But definitely, I know that the stakeholders within that sector will continue to push, right? And we're pretty much supporting them in that instance. Doctor.
Hello, my IPC, sir. Please, you can go ahead. Can go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a point of information in reaction to one of the issues raised about the role of ICANN and stuff. I just want to let you know that I was just trying to confirm. I know that probably in the last 24 hours or in the next 24 hours, ICANN will be releasing a position paper on the 2022 finance bill. So let's watch out for it and share when it comes out. Thank you very much. I'm true. Dr. Titi. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. I can hear you.
Loud and clear, sir. Loud and clear.
Okay, I'm true. That's just the information I want to pass. Is that being released or in the
while
next
you're
4 hours?
session, to you, my IPC. Sorry, I'm putting.
Okay, Madam Titi, can we continue? Okay, I don't know whether there's no other question.
So I just want to pray for our speaker to you, sir, to get your honorable prayers. Hello? Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. You were lost before.
Yeah, okay. I said we have come to the end of the technical session, and just to tell about today that thank you very much. We will be sending you our appreciation as soon as I land in Lagos. I'm out of the country now, but just be rest assured that we appreciate your efforts. Unfortunately, I would have projected your plaque virtually, but I'm not in a comfortable position to do that. So I want to hand you over to my IPC with the permission of the chairman to appreciate your efforts and also to give you his prayers as we round up the session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, on behalf of the chairman, executive members, and the over 600 members of Ilupeju Gbagada Society, I want to appreciate you, Batunde, for a wonderful presentation that you have made. Apart from that, I also want to congratulate you in advance on your new status as FCA, and to also formally welcome you as a bona fide member of Ilupeju Gbagada and District Society.
Yes, sir.
So thank you very much for allowing us to share in your knowledge and experience on the matter that have been discussed today. I'm sure every one of us had listened to you with rapt attention, and our knowledge coast had been enlarged. As a matter of fact, I know that there was a point that we were nearly got into 200 participants on this call. So that tells you the topical nature of the issue and the way you are able to carry everybody along. So we want to appreciate you. And like the technical director have said, by the time he lands back in Nigeria, you will be able to do a little, show a little appreciation by making a presentation of our prestigious plaque to you. I commit you into the mighty hands of God for more knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, even as you continue on your path of progress, both in your career and your profession. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Amen, sir.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, that was the technical session. We thank the paper presenter, the technical secretary. Are you sure this person is one of us?
Omuya will be fine.
Okay, so thank you so much. The paper presenter, technical secretary, and the IPC that were able to do the needful. This is the end of our technical session. Attention, the end of the meeting. I noticed that because of technical session, nobody helped my ministry with donation. Okay, I'll be waiting for us individually, one way or the other. I want to call a member to kindly move for adjournment of this meeting to 26th of February on physical basis. Any member of the district can do that so that I can quickly move on. Now, for this, our visitor, Labara, please go ahead.
Hi, Lara Basile, MB 056361. I move the motion to adjourn the meeting till the next time.
Thank you. Any seconder? Thank you, Labara. Larabas. Thank you so much. Any seconder?
Hi,
okay.
Okay.
Go ahead, madam. Madam, you already have the. Hold on, madam. Go ahead and do it.
Okay. Okay. Hi, Benny Sayabuchi. I saw second. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Emeka Victor, you can pray for us.
All right. In Jesus' name. Father, we thank you for such a wonderful section. Thank you for the knowledge acquired. Thank you that we, as accountants in our various places of endeavors, that we are going to apply this knowledge even as we continue to deliver service and add value to financial reporting and everything else with accounts. And we pray that even as we enter a new week, guide us, O Lord, in all our activities. In Jesus' name, I've prayed.
Amen. Thank you so much. We want to appreciate every one of us as we meet some other time. Take good care of yourself.
Physical meeting.
Collective positions. Bye for now. I think we are having our icon anthem and national anthem.
Let's go, I can found of treasure in triumph of an race, standing stronger in harmony, building
If you are yet to register your name, go to the chat box and do that.